Tonight, we talked about a world far different from our own. A world hundreds of years ago, where even the smallest choice, like the way you dressed, the way you walked, or the way you laughed, could make people whisper about you. A world full of hidden rules, secret meanings, and unexpected labels. Some of these stories might make you smile. Some might surprise you. Tonight, let's take a quiet journey into the Middle Ages and uncover 15 unusual reasons people were called differently. So, relax, take a deep breath, and let's begin this soft journey into history. Reason 1. Clothing choices and fashion signals. Imagine walking through the cobbled streets of a medieval town, the air filled with smoke from hearths, the chatter of merchants, and the distant tolling of church bells. Every day was a careful performance of who you were, not just in action, but in appearance. In the Middle Ages, clothing was far more than mere protection from the cold or decoration. It was a language everyone understood, yet one that could silently judge you. Bright colors, extravagant fabrics, and certain cuts could draw attention, sometimes admiration, sometimes suspicion. Men wearing silk tunics trimmed in fur, or decorative hose that hugged the legs tightly, might be considered effeminate by strict societal standards. And effeminacy, well, that could be enough for whispers to start, for people to point fingers and question a man's masculinity or morality. In some towns, there were even sumptuary laws, legal restrictions on what people could wear based on their class. These laws weren't just about economics, they were about social order. Breaking them could mark someone as frivolous, vain, or morally suspect. A young man of modest birth wearing purple velvet, the color reserved for the elite, could find himself at the center of gossip. Some might tease him, others might label him with words that, in today's language, would be seen as questioning his sexuality. Yet fashion was also a subtle form of rebellion. Some men intentionally chose flamboyant attire, knowing it would make them stand out. Perhaps they enjoyed the attention, perhaps they felt constrained by rigid gender expectations. Either way, medieval society interpreted these choices through a narrow lens. It was not just clothing, it was a signal. And in a world where conformity was prized, standing out could make one a target of labels, judgments, or even ridicule. Clothing also intersected with profession and social roles. Court entertainers, musicians, and minstrels often dressed in brighter, more elaborate attire. Their visibility and performance art could blur the lines between accepted masculinity and perceived flamboyance. A bard might laugh, dance, and wear jewelry, small signs that in another context could be harmless, but here, in the eyes of conservative townsfolk, were enough to spark suspicion. This was not just happenstance. The visual culture of the Middle Ages was keenly attuned to the subtleties of appearance. People noticed small details: the cut of a sleeve, the color of a hose, the way hair was styled. Men who dared to play with these conventions were often teased, mocked, or called names that signaled moral or sexual difference. And though these labels did not match modern definitions of sexuality, they functioned as social markers, ways to categorize, control, and judge. So, next time you think about medieval fashion, remember, every stitch, every hue, every accessory could speak volumes about who you were, or at least who society thought you were. Reason 2. Friendships and physical affection. In today's world, a friendly hug or an arm around a friend's shoulder is seen as normal, even comforting. But in the Middle Ages, physical closeness among men was read differently. Society placed rigid expectations on gender behavior, and any deviation from these norms was heavily scrutinized. Men were expected to be stoic, reserved, and focused on labor, warfare, and family responsibilities. Expressions of warmth that went beyond what was socially necessary could be suspect. Two men walking arm in arm through a market square might simply be close friends, yet onlookers could whisper about their moral character. The same gestures, in private, might be accepted. but public displays carried weight. Religious teachings also influenced these perceptions. Monks, clergy, and theologians frequently warned against lustful thoughts and behaviors. Friendship, though celebrated in theory, could be twisted into suspicion if observed in the wrong context. Letters and chronicles from the period often lamented young men forming too close bonds, fearing moral corruption or scandal. Even intimate gestures like sharing a bed were not unusual, particularly in the cold winters or among apprentices in workshops. These arrangements were practical, but observers might interpret them otherwise. Historians today note that labeling someone as gay, in the medieval sense, often had little to do with sexual orientation as we understand it. It was more about perceived deviation from expected conduct, whether in dress, speech, or physical behavior. Cultural stories and songs also reflected these anxieties. Tales of men who were overly affectionate, sentimental, or artistic were often laced with warnings or moral lessons. These narratives reinforced societal expectations and subtly taught the populace which behaviors were acceptable, and which would earn labels. Yet friendships were deeply valued. Bonds between men could be life-saving, spiritually nurturing, or politically strategic. The problem arose when society tried to read too much into these bonds. A man's loyalty, generosity, or sensitivity could, in a world obsessed with rigid masculinity, mark him as different. So, friendship and physical affection were a delicate dance. The gestures that today feel normal, comforting, or even trivial, could in medieval society become reasons for whispers, suspicion, and social labeling. Reason 3. Artistic expression and creativity. The Middle Ages are often thought of as austere, dominated by rigid hierarchies and the Church's authority. Yet creativity thrived, and with it came subtle markers of difference. Poetry, music, and visual art were not only expressions of talent, they were also mirrors reflecting society's attitudes toward behavior, identity, and even sexuality. Young men who showed exceptional talent in arts, particularly in forms considered feminine or delicate, were often viewed with suspicion. Singing, composing, dancing, or writing with great sensitivity could suggest softness or affectation, qualities that, in a male, might trigger labels of moral or sexual difference. Patrons of the arts, however, often welcomed such creativity, particularly in courts or among noble families. The tension between social acceptance and peer judgment created an environment where artists walked a fine line. Their work could elevate them or expose them to ridicule. Chroniclers sometimes recorded these subtleties, hinting at society's fascination and discomfort with men who embraced artistic sensibilities. Visual art was especially revealing. Miniatures, tapestries, and illuminations often depicted courtly love, intimate friendships, and delicate gestures. Men portrayed with long hair, finely detailed garments, or expressive gestures were sometimes praised for elegance, other times criticized for effeminacy. These interpretations were deeply subjective, reflecting the observer's biases more than any reality about the person depicted. Even in religious contexts, creativity carried risks. Manuscript illumination, choir performance, and ceremonial dancing were all male-dominated activities, yet excessive flourish or beauty could invite gossip. A monk who crafted unusually ornate decorations, or a scribe who lingered over the beauty of letters, might be labeled as soft or different by peers who equated discipline with masculinity. Art, then, became a subtle marker of identity. Those who embraced it fully risked being misunderstood. Labels were not just about actions, they were about the impression one left on society, the aura of difference that could provoke whispers, judgments, and assumptions. Creativity offered freedom, yes, but also vulnerability. In the eyes of the medieval town, a man's skill with words, music, or brush could simultaneously impress and alarm. And so, artistic expression became one of the quiet, yet powerful, ways someone might be called gay. not in the modern sexual sense, but in the sense of being marked as socially and morally different. Reason 4. Love of poetry and courtly romance. Imagine the gentle flicker of candlelight in a stone-walled chamber, the faint scratch of a quill across parchment. In the Middle Ages, poetry was more than just words. It was a way of life, a subtle art of expressing emotions that could not be spoken aloud in public. And for men who dared to indulge deeply in this world of beauty and sensitivity, society often took notice. Courtly love was the prevailing cultural framework, and it encouraged elaborate expressions of admiration, longing, and devotion. Knights would write letters and poems praising ladies of the court, extolling virtues, or lamenting unfulfilled desire. These gestures were ritualized, formalized, and appreciated, but the men who excelled in expressing tender emotions risked being seen as soft, effeminate, or morally suspect. The Middle Ages valued stoicism, physical courage, and martial skill in men. Poetry, however, demanded vulnerability. To craft a sonnet, to sigh over verses, to linger on words that spoke of longing or beauty. These were acts that exposed the heart. While in the courts, these acts could earn admiration. In everyday town life they could provoke whispers. Friends, neighbors, and rivals could interpret a man's sensitivity as a deviation from accepted masculine norms, sometimes labeling him with terms that hinted at effeminacy or difference. Letters, diaries, and historical accounts reveal the tension between art and society. For instance, troubadours in southern France were celebrated for their skill, yet their focus on emotional and romantic subtleties often led others to question their masculine rigor. The very act of indulging in beauty, of crafting elegant expressions, was viewed with a mixture of awe and suspicion. This perception extended beyond the courts. Townsfolk, who had little understanding of artistic nuance, could read these gestures as signs of fragility or moral looseness. A man who spent hours composing delicate verses, adorned in fine fabrics while reciting them aloud, might be admired for talent but also quietly labeled as someone different. These labels did not indicate sexual behavior in the modern sense. They were markers of social perception, a warning system of conformity and deviation. Even in religious poetry, the tension existed. Monks and scholars often produced deeply moving verse. Their contemplative, sensitive nature could suggest softness to others who equated masculinity with physical labor, authority, and toughness. So, embracing poetry and courtly romance was a subtle act of rebellion, and a potential reason for gossip and labeling. The world of medieval poetry was a paradox. It offered freedom of emotional expression, the thrill of admiration, and the elegance of language, but also vulnerability to social scrutiny. Every word, every flourish of sentiment, was a potential reason for whispers. And in a society where deviation from masculine norms was closely monitored, poetry could make a man stand out in ways both admired and criticized. Reason 5. Musical talent and sensitivity. Imagine the soft strumming of a lute in a dimly lit hall, notes drifting through the air like whispers of another world. Music was the heartbeat of the Middle Ages, present in courts, towns, and religious ceremonies alike. For those with natural musical talent, life offered a double-edged gift: admiration from some, suspicion from others. Men who could sing with sweetness, play delicate instruments, or compose intricate melodies were often admired in the courts for their refinement. But in towns and villages with strict masculine expectations, musical sensitivity could be interpreted as effeminate or morally questionable. Society valued men who were physically strong, capable in battle, and practical in trade. Emotional or artistic expression through music sometimes conflicted with these norms. Consider the traveling minstrels, who performed for nobles and commoners alike. Their clothes were often colorful, their gestures dramatic, and their songs full of romantic or emotional depth. While celebrated on stage, in everyday life, the same behaviors could draw scrutiny. Observers might whisper about the performer's character, using labels that hinted at moral or sexual difference. Again, these labels were not about actual sexual orientation. They reflected perceptions of deviation from social expectations. In monasteries, music carried spiritual significance. Choir boys and monks learned to sing with exceptional sensitivity, and the same traits that produced divine harmonies could also create perceptions of softness in character. Letters from medieval scholars sometimes note these observations, hinting at the tension between artistic excellence and societal expectations. Interestingly, musical talent was also associated with social mobility. Skilled musicians could gain patronage, travel widely, and enjoy privileges others did not. But this visibility was a double-edged sword, admiration mixed with gossip, and every act of refinement risked interpretation as a sign of difference. So, musical talent, while a source of joy, livelihood, and spiritual fulfillment, also exposed men to judgment. The very traits that made someone a gifted singer or musician, sensitivity, elegance, emotional expression, were enough for medieval society to label them as unusual or different. And these labels, though far removed from modern ideas of sexuality, contributed to the social phenomenon that today we interpret as calling someone gay in historical context. Reason 6. Grooming, hair, and personal hygiene. Picture a medieval street in early morning, mist rising from the cobblestones, as townsfolk begin their daily routines. Hygiene and grooming, often overlooked today, carried profound social meaning in the Middle Ages. The way a man presented himself could speak louder than words. Hair was particularly significant. Long, carefully combed hair, curls, or elaborate styles were sometimes seen as a sign of vanity or effeminacy. In a society that prized toughness and practicality in men, excessive attention to grooming could provoke whispers. Barbers were not just stylists, they were cultural arbiters, shaping perceptions of gender, status, and morality. Bathing habits, too, were socially significant. While the common myth suggests medieval people never bathed, historical records indicate that hygiene practices were widespread in towns, especially among the elite. Still, attention to personal cleanliness and fragrance could mark someone as overly concerned with appearance, a potential reason for moral speculation. Perfumes, scented oils, and delicate linen garments were subtle markers of refinement, and occasionally suspicion. Clothing and grooming intersected with social status. A nobleman might wear a well-cut tunic and maintain perfectly combed hair without question, while a commoner doing the same could draw gossip. This double standard reflects the complex way medieval society read appearance. A man's effort to maintain elegance, neatness, or a particular style could earn admiration, envy, or suspicion, depending on context. Even military men were judged by grooming. A knight with excessively soft hands, carefully trimmed hair, or ornamental armor could be teased or labeled by peers. These judgments often intersected with broader assumptions about masculinity, strength, and morality. Thus, grooming, hair, and hygiene were subtle yet powerful markers. They could elevate social status, signify care and refinement, or, conversely, provoke gossip and labels of difference. In a society attuned to visual and behavioral signals, personal appearance was more than self-expression. It was a language that could quietly shape reputations and identities. Reason 6. Grooming, hair, and personal hygiene. Picture a medieval street in early morning, mist rising from the cobblestones, as townsfolk begin their daily routines. Hygiene and grooming, often overlooked today, carried profound social meaning in the Middle Ages. The way a man presented himself could speak louder than words. Hair was particularly significant. Long, carefully combed hair, curls, or elaborate styles were sometimes seen as a sign of vanity or effeminacy. In a society that prized toughness and practicality in men, excessive attention to grooming could provoke whispers. Barbers were not just stylists, they were cultural arbiters, shaping perceptions of gender, status, and morality. Bathing habits, too, were socially significant. While the common myth suggests medieval people never bathed, historical records indicate that hygiene practices were widespread in towns, especially among the elite. Still, attention to personal cleanliness and fragrance could mark someone as overly concerned with appearance, a potential reason for moral speculation. Perfumes, scented oils, and delicate linen garments were subtle markers of refinement, and occasionally suspicion. Clothing and grooming intersected with social status. A nobleman might wear a well-cut tunic and maintain perfectly combed hair without question, while a commoner doing the same could draw gossip. This double standard reflects the complex way medieval society read appearance. A man's effort to maintain elegance, neatness, or a particular style could earn admiration, envy, or suspicion, depending on context. Even military men were judged by grooming. A knight with excessively soft hands, carefully trimmed hair, or ornamental armor could be teased or labeled by peers. These judgments often intersected with broader assumptions about masculinity, strength, and morality. Thus, grooming, hair, and hygiene were subtle yet powerful markers. They could elevate social status, signify care and refinement, or, conversely, provoke gossip and labels of difference. In a society attuned to visual and behavioral signals, personal appearance was more than self-expression. It was a language that could quietly shape reputations and identities. Reason 7. Participation in theatre and performance. Imagine a small medieval village preparing for a festival. The air is thick with excitement, the smell of bread baking, and the distant sound of drums. At the center of the square, a group of men prepare to perform a short play, perhaps a morality tale, perhaps a comedic farce. Theatres in the Middle Ages were not grand stages like in modern cities. They were humble, temporary spaces, but for the performers, they were opportunities to express creativity, emotion, and subtle critique. Men who engaged in acting or performing took on roles that required exaggeration of gesture, tone, and expression. In a society that valued stoicism and restraint in men, these exaggerated behaviors could easily be misinterpreted. A man who laughed openly, gestured dramatically, or portrayed sensitive emotions on stage could attract attention that went beyond admiration. Observers sometimes whispered that such a man was soft, effeminate, or morally lax. Traveling troupes often performed in markets, courts, and religious festivals. Their visibility made them famous, but it also exposed them to gossip. Unlike the anonymity of private practice, public performance magnified perception. A performer's flamboyance, passion, and artistry were not always appreciated. Sometimes, they became reasons for labeling and social judgment. Historical records suggest that court performances, particularly in noble households, were complex social arenas. Noble patrons could celebrate a performer's talent, yet rival courtiers might seize upon small signs of effeminacy or excessive sensitivity to gossip or ridicule. Plays themselves sometimes contain subtle commentary on morality, gender, and social norms, reflecting the tension between societal expectations and individual expression. Even in religious theatre, such as mystery or morality plays, actors navigated a fine line. Portraying a character too tenderly or dramatically could attract moral scrutiny. Society often conflated theatrical expressiveness with personal character. A man who excelled in performance, demonstrating sensitivity, elegance, or emotion, might inadvertently be labeled as different by contemporaries. Theatre, therefore, was both liberation and risk. It allowed men to explore emotion, creativity, and identity, yet it also heightened the visibility of traits considered unconventional. Participation in performance could be a path to recognition, financial stability, and artistic fulfillment, but also a reason for whispers, suspicion, and social labeling. In the medieval imagination, the line between admiration and judgment was thin, and those who lived creatively often walked it carefully. Reason 8. Interest in healing, herbalism, and caregiving. In the Middle Ages, the world of healing and herbalism was dominated by observation, careful practice, and deep knowledge of nature. Some men took on the role of healers, preparing salves, poultices, and potions, and offering care to the sick and injured. Their knowledge was practical and valuable, yet the social perception of such men was complicated. Society assigned caregiving, nurturing, and domestic healing roles predominantly to women. A man who devoted himself to these tasks, especially with patience, gentleness, and attention to detail, might be viewed with suspicion. His behavior, though life-saving, could be read as soft or morally different, provoking gossip. Such labeling did not necessarily correlate with sexual behavior, but rather with deviation from expected masculine roles. Men who practiced herbalism also navigated spiritual and magical associations. Herbs, remedies, and charms carried both medicinal and mystical significance. Some healers were respected, others were feared or mocked, particularly if their methods or demeanor suggested refinement, delicacy, or emotional sensitivity. In smaller towns, whispers often spread faster than facts. Historical records indicate that certain men became renowned for their skill in midwifery, nursing, or herbal remedies. While they were indispensable to communities, their close involvement with intimate, domestic, and soft aspects of life sometimes earned them labels that implied difference. Chroniclers occasionally recorded such men in stories of curiosity, scandal, or moral caution, reflecting the societal tension between necessity and normative gender expectations. The act of caregiving itself, in medieval eyes, could mark someone as unusual. Gentle hands, attentiveness, and empathy were admirable traits, but when displayed by men outside their traditional social role, they became a potential reason for gossip and speculation. A man who healed, nurtured, and tended to others could find himself celebrated in one circle and subtly ostracized in another. Herbalism, medicine, and caregiving were, therefore, double-edged swords. They allowed men to exercise intelligence, skill, and compassion. Yet in a society with rigid definitions of masculinity, these same traits could trigger whispers. In the medieval imagination, gentleness and attentiveness were not neutral. They were read as signs of difference, sometimes marked with terms that echo the labeling practices referenced in today's historical analyses of sexuality. Reason 9. Association with the arts of dance and movement. Imagine stepping into a grand hall, lit by hundreds of candles, the scent of wax and wood filling the air. Music begins to play, and men and women move gracefully across the floor. Dance was a central part of medieval social life, from courts to festivals. But for men, mastery of movement and grace was a delicate art. A man who moved with precision, elegance, or expressive fluidity might attract admiration and subtle suspicion. Society expected men to prioritize labor, strength, and stoicism. Dance, particularly when performed with flair or sensitivity, could be interpreted as an indulgence in frivolity or excess. Observers sometimes whispered, drawing conclusions about character, morality, or even sexual orientation. Dance instruction and social training were often tied to nobility. Young men of high status were taught etiquette, posture, and graceful movement alongside combat skills. Yet even among the elite, deviation from rigid masculine norms could spark gossip. A knight who danced with particular delicacy, or a young squire who lingered in refinement, risked being labeled as effeminate by peers who equated grace with softness. Public festivals amplified these dynamics. Men performing in group dances, masquerades, or ceremonial rituals were highly visible. Every movement, gesture, and flourish was noted. While skill could earn praise, it could also invite whispers, curiosity, amusement, or subtle judgment. Medieval chronicles occasionally reference men admired for elegance, but simultaneously critiqued for perceived softness or affectation. Dance, then, functioned as a social mirror. It revealed skill, discipline, and artistry, but also personality, temperament, and perceived deviation from masculine ideals. The act of moving gracefully, expressing oneself through rhythm, and participating in choreographed social rituals could mark a man as unusual in the eyes of his contemporaries. In the medieval imagination, the boundary between elegance and effeminacy, between admired artistry and socially different behavior, was narrow. Dance became a language through which society read subtle signs of identity, character, and conformity. A man who embraced its beauty fully could find himself celebrated in some circles, whispered about in others, and ultimately labeled in ways that, while not modern, echo the social mechanisms historians today interpret as reasons someone might have been called gay. Reason 10. Interest in astrology and mystical knowledge. Picture a quiet evening in a medieval study. Candles flicker against stone walls, casting long shadows, as a young man pores over charts of stars and planets. Astrology, alchemy, and mystical knowledge fascinated many in the Middle Ages. But for men, an intense interest in these arts could draw suspicion. Society valued men who were practical, disciplined, and engaged in visible labor or warfare. A man who spent hours reading celestial charts, interpreting omens, or studying the influence of planets on human behavior could be perceived as indulging in fanciful or unmanly pursuits. Whispered judgments could arise. His focus on abstract knowledge and sensitivity to cosmic patterns might be seen as softness or deviation from masculine norms. Astrology was not merely a pastime. It was deeply intertwined with medicine, agriculture, and governance. Princes consulted astrologers before battles. Physicians relied on celestial charts to time treatments, and merchants used horoscopes to plan trade. Yet, paradoxically, the very traits that made a man skilled in these arts, patience, observation, subtlety, and sensitivity, could also mark him as socially different. Historical chronicles contain examples of men who were renowned for mystical knowledge but criticized for perceived effeminacy or eccentricity. The line between respected scholar and social outsider was fine. The community often judged behavior and appearance more than intellectual merit, so those with unconventional interests risked whispers and labels. Interest in astrology also intersected with spiritual beliefs. Some religious authorities viewed mystical practices with caution, linking excessive fascination with the heavens to moral weakness or distraction from earthly duties. A man who devoted himself to stars rather than swordplay or labor might thus be seen as straying from accepted masculinity. So, pursuing astrology and mystical knowledge offered both enlightenment and vulnerability. It allowed men to explore intelligence, intuition, and cosmic understanding, but at the same time, it made them visible, remarkable, and occasionally marked as different in medieval eyes. Reason 11. Unconventional humor and wit. Imagine a lively medieval feast. The hall echoes with laughter as jesters, nobles, and guests share stories and clever remarks. Humor, as subtle as it was, could define social perception. Men who possessed sharp wit, playful sarcasm, or a penchant for clever wordplay could attract attention that went beyond admiration. Society expected men to demonstrate stoicism, restraint, and seriousness in most aspects of life. A man who frequently used humor to charm, tease, or play with social norms might be seen as frivolous, indulgent, or morally lax. Whispered labels could emerge, suggesting that his wit indicated effeminacy or social deviation. Jesters and performers provide historical examples. While valued for entertainment, their social position was precarious. Clever jokes and verbal dexterity earned praise but also scrutiny. The audience often conflated artistic skill with personal character, interpreting sensitivity, flamboyance, or playful nature as markers of difference. Even in private correspondence or diaries, Medieval observers noted men who employed humor in unconventional ways. Letters might describe a man's cleverness with admiration, yet also hint at subtle concerns about morality or masculinity. Socially, humor was a tool and a potential liability. Its reception depended on context, audience, and perceived adherence to gender norms. Unconventional humor functioned as both shield and spotlight. It allowed men to navigate social hierarchies, gain influence, or entertain peers, yet every joke or clever remark carried risk. In a society attuned to behavioral cues, humor could become a reason for whispers, suspicion, or subtle labeling, even if the man's personal life aligned with conventional expectations. Thus, in the medieval imagination, wit and humor were double-edged. They celebrated intelligence and creativity, but could also mark someone as socially unusual, a potential reason for being called gay in the context of perception, not modern sexual identity. Reason 12. Love of animals and gentle companionship. Picture a tranquil medieval courtyard, early morning light spilling over stone walls, where a young man tends to his animals, dogs, cats, or perhaps birds. A gentle touch, careful feeding, and quiet attention to these creatures marked him as tender and empathetic, traits deeply admired by some but potentially scrutinized by others. In medieval society, masculinity was often associated with strength, labor, and dominance. A man who showed excessive care for animals, who lingered in the company of pets or expressed deep emotion in these interactions, could be seen as deviating from societal norms. Whispered labels might emerge, interpreting tenderness as softness or moral difference. Historical records suggest that care for animals was not universally questioned. Nobles, knights, and commoners often prized hunting, falconry, and animal husbandry. Yet the way a man expressed empathy and gentleness could differentiate him. A knight known for showing mercy to animals rather than strict discipline, or a squire who spent hours grooming a horse, could attract attention and subtle gossip. Animals themselves provided an emotional outlet. Men who cultivated patience, observation, and empathy through animal companionship developed traits considered unusual in their communities. Tenderness, sensitivity, and emotional attunement were admirable qualities, but were also markers of perceived difference. Chroniclers occasionally noted these men, sometimes in admiration, sometimes in cautionary tales about softness or effeminacy. This association extended to spiritual symbolism as well. Animals represented loyalty, virtue, and purity in many medieval texts. A man attentive to these creatures could be read as morally and spiritually refined, but at the same time, outside the strict bounds of conventional masculinity. Thus, love for animals and gentle companionship became a subtle social marker. It revealed kindness, emotional intelligence, and moral awareness, yet could also provoke whispers and labels in a culture obsessed with defined gender roles. In this way a man treated creatures both great and small could be a reason for being called different in medieval society. Reason 14. Interest in decorative arts and crafts. Reason 13. Engagement with intellectual debates. Imagine a quiet medieval hall filled with parchment scrolls, the faint scent of ink and candle wax lingering in the air. Men gather to discuss philosophy, theology, or natural science. Engaging deeply in intellectual debates was admired in certain circles, yet it also carried social risks. Society expected men to demonstrate practicality, action, and visible labor. A man who spent long hours discussing abstract ideas, questioning norms, or debating with eloquence could be seen as devoting himself to frivolous or unmanly pursuits. His peers might whisper that he was different, effeminate, or morally lax, even if his arguments were logical and insightful. Universities and monastic schools were hubs for intellectual engagement. Students and scholars immersed themselves in dialectics, astronomy, and theology. While these pursuits were respected within scholarly communities, townsfolk and lay people sometimes viewed them with suspicion. Deep curiosity, sensitivity, and articulate expression, all qualities necessary for intellectual debate, could be interpreted as signs of deviation from expected masculine behavior. Historical accounts occasionally depict men whose intelligence and eloquence earned admiration from teachers or patrons, but simultaneously provoked envy or gossip. Their skill with words, subtlety in reasoning, and emotional responsiveness could mark them as unusual. Social labeling often focused not on their knowledge, but on perceived softness or deviation from rigid norms of masculinity. Participation in debates was thus a delicate act. It offered intellectual freedom, social prestige, and opportunities for personal growth, yet also made one visible to judgment. In the medieval imagination, brilliance and sensitivity were double-edged, admired and feared simultaneously. This combination could be enough for a man to be labeled different, echoing historical ways people were called gay in societal perception, rather than modern sexual identity. Picture a medieval workshop filled with the smell of wood, wax, and paint. Men work carefully, carving, painting, and decorating objects with meticulous attention. Decorative arts, from intricate embroidery to delicate metalwork, required patience, precision, and an eye for beauty. Yet, in a society that prized physical labor, toughness, and stoicism in men, these qualities could provoke whispers. Men who devoted themselves to decorative crafts were sometimes admired for skill and ingenuity, especially in noble households or guilds. But in towns or villages with rigid masculine expectations, the same attention to detail and aesthetic sensibility could mark them as different. Observers might associate sensitivity with effeminacy, leading to social labeling. Guild records, chronicles, and accounts of craftsmen reveal a recurring tension. Skilled artisans who embraced beauty, refinement, and elegance often walked a fine line between respect and gossip. Their social visibility amplified this effect. A man who spent hours perfecting intricate designs might be lauded by patrons, but quietly questioned by peers who equated masculine virtue with strength and practicality. Decorative arts also intersected with economic and social mobility. Success in craft could bring wealth and recognition, yet also increase scrutiny. A man's reputation depended not just on skill, but on perceived alignment with social norms. Traits such as patience, care, and aesthetic refinement, vital for mastery of craft, could inadvertently provoke assumptions about moral or gender difference. Thus, engagement in decorative arts was both empowering and vulnerable. It allowed men to express creativity, achieve recognition, and explore intellectual and artistic realms, but also risked whispers, judgment, and labeling by a society attuned to subtle cues of difference. Reason 15. Association with courtly intrigue and subtle influence. Imagine the hushed corridors of a medieval castle, tapestries lining the walls, the soft rustle of silk gowns and polished boots. Politics, alliances, and subtle influence were central to court life. Men who engaged in negotiation, diplomacy, or manipulation needed wit, intelligence, and subtlety, qualities that, paradoxically, could be interpreted as signs of difference. In the eyes of peers, a man who wielded influence with finesse rather than brute strength could provoke suspicion. Subtlety, charm, and strategic thinking were admired by some but feared or misunderstood by others. Whispered labels could emerge, suggesting moral softness, cunning, or even effeminacy. Historical records note courtiers who excelled in intrigue, negotiation, or intellectual maneuvering. Their effectiveness depended on social perception, emotional intelligence, and careful observation. Yet these same qualities, when exhibited too visibly, could draw gossip or criticism. Society often conflated social skill and refinement with deviation from expected masculine norms. Participation in courtly life required constant navigation of appearances, reputation, and behavior. Every gesture, compliment, or strategic act could be read in multiple ways. For men in these positions, visibility was double-edged. It offered prestige and influence, yet also exposed them to judgment and labeling. Courtly intrigue highlights the medieval tendency to monitor subtle differences in behavior, character, and social engagement. A man could be admired for intelligence, respected for influence, and yet quietly labeled as different due to societal expectations of masculinity. These perceptions, while not reflective of modern sexual identity, echo the historical context in which men were called gay for behaviors or traits outside strict norms. And there you have it. 15 reasons, glimpses into a world far different from our own, where every choice, every gesture, and every talent could shape how a man was seen. From clothing and friendship, to music, poetry, and courtly intrigue, society's eyes were always watching, interpreting, and sometimes judging. If you enjoyed this quiet journey through history, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel for more stories from the past, and leave a comment sharing which point surprised you the most. Your support helps bring history to life, softly, thoughtfully, and with care. Thank you for watching, and until next time, let history whisper to you.